have an educational project that Karen Cariani is one of the directors of, called Teacher's Domain, which Margaret briefly talked about yesterday. And what Teacher's Domain, it's an online education resource, K through 12. And it started actually in the Media Library and Archives about 12 or 15 years ago, when we realized that we have a lot of video content that could be used for educational purposes. So we created this site, which uses our video resources. And it's largely been science because our archive for science is so large because of the NOVA collection that we have. And as we've added to it, the last grant we had was from the Hewlett Foundation. And the Hewlett Foundation, of course, required that all the assets in that next chapter be available as open resources, open content. So what we did, it was pretty challenging, and I have to thank Hewlett for pushing the envelope with us, but it was incredibly difficult. Because what we did was we took 15 or 20 assets. So how many were there from the?
900.
Well, there were 900, but there are new ones. How many new ones?
20 new ones.
We had 20 new assets, which we put into this latest unit. And then we had 900 assets that we were looking at, which meant that we were going back and looking at all the previous content that we had included in Teacher's Domain to see if we could make it available as open content. Now you have to understand, we are professional documentary filmmakers. We are signatory to a number of collective bargaining agreements with writers, actors, musicians. So we have a SAG agreement and AFTRA agreement. We have a director, we don't have Directors Guild, but we have writers and AFM for musicians.
We have directors.
And they have Directors Guild. And then on top of that, if you've ever seen NOVA, you know that there's a lot of material that we didn't shoot. So there's a lot of third-party material from stock footage houses and archival stills houses, literally from around the world. And they're all subject to different terms and conditions. So we had to sit down and think, how are we going to get these talent agreements, which as Josh talked about, the trilogy, the union agreements still look at territorial restrictions, they still look at media. So you have this kind of a la carte menu when you look at rights, and the union agreements haven't kind of acknowledged convergence yet. So you have all of this legacy content which has enormous encumbrances. So you have archives you're clearing, you have music you're clearing, and everyone knows anecdotally how difficult it is to clear music. So you have all of these issues, and what happened for us in this last grant that we had, we had to take those 900 resources and figure out how to make them open. And we weren't successful in doing that because we couldn't change the world, we couldn't change copyright law, we couldn't change the way archives do business, and we certainly could not change the way our union agreements operate at this point in time, although our plans are to continue to work on all these fronts. So we had to come up with a number of levels, ranging from rights we already had for streaming only, working through 3 other levels. Ultimately, the last level was a fully downloadable open resource which could be mixed and mashed. So we had, at one end of the spectrum, something which was fully open. At the other end of the spectrum, we had something which could only be streamed. And in the middle, we had something where you could take that 2-minute clip, say it's a 2-minute clip of cells dividing from ANOVA. You could take that 2-minute clip, but if that had other resources, that 2-minute clip could be used in another derivative work, but only as a 2-minute piece. You couldn't mix and match within that 2-minute piece. Whereas the last level, you could mix and match within that 2-minute piece. So we had these different levels for these 900 resources. So the challenge that we had was we approached Creative Commons and Eric to say, is it possible to develop a CC education license? And because a lot of our clearance is for educational purposes, but and we have the right to create derivative works only at that last level. All requirements are that they be non-commercial, and of course we would require that anyone give attribution if they're using that content. But how do you guarantee your licensors or the talent that you have that you are in fact using those rights for educational purposes? Because as we know, once something is downloaded to a 15-year-old kid's computer, it's out there in the ether, it's out there in the world. So we approached Creative Commons about doing an education license so that we could get further assurance, and then we could then pass on the assurances to our licensors or unions or whoever we were dealing with, that we were in fact limiting what could be done and tag this material as education content. And unfortunately, the CC board rejected that proposition for the reasons that Eric cited. They're concerned about the proliferation of licenses, and they want to ensure the operability of licenses. That's why we had to stick with the 4 different levels that we have, because we felt that only in the last level where it's fully mixable, you can create derivative works, those were the clearances that we got, which did not have to be limited to education. And I really think in a lot of ways it's a loss for us, because it creates a huge risk for us to say, okay, we're going to move everything to open content, when in fact we don't have those rights from our third-party rights holders. So we're still at it. We're still looking to see how we now queue up, upcoming labor negotiations. This has resulted in some real serious thinking about how to, possibly approach Congress and change the copyright law, and how to deal with stock footage and stills licensors. So it's queued us up for some work that we will now spend a lot of time doing over this upcoming year in this arena. But at this point in time, it's still incredibly complicated. So that's kind of the scenario that we had.